Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. Since the 1930s, the unions SAG and AFTRA have been advocating and protecting the rights of performing artists in media. Well, times have changed, but that doesn't mean the mission has. Managing these complicated arenas, I'm delighted to be joined by SAG COO and General Counsel, Duncan Crabtree-Ireland.
Hi,
Now that's a name for a marquee right then and there.
Yeah, I've often been told it sounds like I'm a law firm all by myself, but clearly hyphenated names are the way to go.
You bet. All right. So a lot is going on within the industry right now, but most importantly, the fact that production is starting to begin again. But with performing artists, I imagine there are a lot of rules and regs. So what are the protections that you are offering your performers to make sure that they're safe in the workplace?
Sure. Well, it's been a tough time, of course. It's been several months since anyone's been able to really get on a set and do any kind of production. We estimate that our members have lost around $500 million in earnings during this time period. And that's not just big stars. That's a lot of working performers who rely on their income to pay a mortgage and pay their rent and buy groceries and things like that. So we're really focused on helping everyone get back to work, but it has to be safe. So the kind of protections, like you asked, that we're looking for are really focused on, number one, making sure that there's some form of testing in place, COVID testing, for people who are going to be working either as performers or with performers who have to work with no protective equipment on or without physical distancing in many cases. In addition to that, we're looking for a zone system to be established on set. That basically means that there would be this sort of zone A area, the central zone, where performers and those who have to work directly with them are sort of in that zone. And then the rest of the crew who don't need to have direct contact with performers when they're not wearing masks, when they're not physically distanced, can be in a sort of outer zone. And why this is important is it helps inform the question of when people get tested, how frequently they get tested, things like that. We've actually had the chance to work together both with the industry on a document that we've put out that lays out a lot of protocols, and also separately with a group of the main labor unions in the industry. And we've really come up with what we think is a plan that can be practically implemented, but that also provides a high degree of safety for the performers and the crew who have to be working under those conditions. And so it really isn't going to be business as usual, but business can be done, we think, with those kind of protections in place.
One of the early adapters was the daytime drama Bold and Beautiful. It started back into production and then paused production. What happened?
Well, as far as specific productions, I'm not really at liberty to comment on their productions. But what I can tell you is, in general terms, a few things. We've had a number of different productions start. We've had some commercials kick back in. We have some feature films that are shooting both here in Southern California and also around the world. And we have some television projects like the one you mentioned that have started back. In general, what those productions are finding is that the testing piece is really important, because if you don't test people prior to everyone returning to set and then regularly test them thereafter, what's going to potentially happen is you may have an outbreak or a problem on set, and then at that point you have to shut down because you've got an active COVID situation going on. And so it's much better to really be preventive rather than not be preventive. And again, I'm not commenting on any particular production, but in general terms, that's one of the reasons why we feel testing is so important. And in fact, in the paper called The Safe Way Forward that the unions released, there's a section, part 2 of that paper, and I don't want to get too technical, but our epidemiologists that we work with put together a series of models of what could happen on a set, of actually several hundred models they ran through a computerized modeling system. And the result of that modeling was that if you have testing at a certain frequency, you can dramatically reduce the likelihood of any outbreaks on set. And that's really important for the protection of performers, but that's also really important for protection of the industry, because the industry needs to not have productions start and stop and start and stop. And one of the best ways to prevent that is to have a good, solid testing program in place.
There's also an emotional component here too, and since SAG-AFTRA does represent, the performers themselves. What if the level of comfort of a performer is not there? I mean, what kind of rights do they have to say, I know I'm under contract right now, I know you're back into production right now, but I'm really not feeling good about coming back, and maybe there's an underlying cause, maybe they just don't want to share that personal medical information. Do they have any kind of rights in this regard?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely they do. And I think before we even get to the question of rights, there's the real question you have to ask, which is, being a performer, it's an artistic performance that you have to do. It's a headspace you have to be in. And can you imagine expecting somebody to be able to do that in an environment where they are in fear for their own personal safety,
Sure.
for their life? And so I think the goal really is to give enough protections, to have enough protections in place that assurances can be made to performers that they can feel comfortable to actually get in there and do their job. But as you pointed out, that's going to be different for each person because different people have different vulnerabilities. And that may be their own personal vulnerability, or it might be their spouse or someone who lives in their home with them, or their child, or whomever. And so, especially for performers who were contracted to work on productions prior to the pandemic starting, it's very clear there's a change of circumstances there, and our expectation is that producers are going to work with those individuals to either address the concerns that they have through some kind of accommodation, or they may, end up not going forward with that contractual obligation. I think it might be viewed a little differently for somebody who chooses now that the circumstances are known, if the circumstances of the production are laid out as part of that contractual negotiation, there may be a different perspective on that. So I think it's going to vary by performer, but generally speaking, anybody who feels unsafe in their workplace isn't going to be expected to go in there and try to do that job. And I think so far the producers that I've encountered where there's this concern have worked really hard to assuage those concerns and make sure that people feel comfortable coming back.
And I imagine production companies are using some pretty unorthodox / aggressive moves to make sure that those environments are safe. I had heard about fog and light and even using inanimate objects as a stand-in for a human in certain settings.
Yeah, definitely, creativity is called for under these circumstances for sure, and it extends to the things that you just mentioned. It also extends to the question of quarantine. We've had a few productions, not many, but a few where one of the strategies is to actually quarantine the cast and the crew together and then try to use that as a way to help reduce the risk of an outbreak happening. There are pros and cons to each of those types of strategies, and I personally don't expect to see quarantine being widely adopted. Because of cost factors and other reasons attached to that. But I do think that everyone's trying to be creative and really make sure that they're not the one who has a big outbreak on their set. I don't think anybody wants that.
Nobody wants to be that person.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so you mentioned emergency funds, and I know that there's some opportunities there, so people can log on to the foundation, look for emergency funds, but also other things that are happening in this period of adaptation. There's a lot of performers and there's a lot of at-home experiences. So does SAG-AFTRA have any kind of governing rights over that? I mean, how is a performer, a broadcaster, et cetera, protected when they have to then be their own production company at home? I mean, that's kind of an arena where we're watching everybody in their house. So
Right.
How is that playing out for you?
Well, actually, a number of our productions have shifted to a work from home mode. I mean, there's certain TV series, for example, that have done episodes using video conference technology. Those are still covered, fully covered under our collective bargaining agreements. The fact that the performers are working from home doesn't change anything. Just as if you were in an office environment and your employer said, "Oh, work from home today," that doesn't change anything about your contractual relationship with your employer. It does mean there's a lot of performers making their own self-generated content right now. A lot of that we don't cover. Some of it we do cover, depending on the nature of it. But I think what people really are looking forward to, I mean, people do enjoy making self-generated content, and a lot of times it can turn out really great. But I think people are really excited to get back to the larger, more sort of broad-based professional productions that people are really excited to do. I think there will be some work from home that's going to stay, and one of those things is going to be casting. I think a lot more casting is going to be done remotely, at least in the early stages of casting. We were already well down that road before the pandemic, but
Self-tapes.
Exactly. But I think the pandemic has clearly locked us into that mode for many aspects of pre-production and casting.
When you were talking about the fact that there is somewhat of a monitoring with these at-home things, I just, you walk into in front of your bookcase, you get your Zoom camera and you sign in that you've actually shown up. I know that's
exactly.
No. But there are other topics that are extremely important in the realm of performing arts right now. And one of that is diversity and inclusion. So what are some of the things that SAG-AFTRA is doing to promote diversity and inclusion, and actually maybe even adjust to the needs that obviously are very apparent?
Absolutely. I think there's several fronts that we're working on in that area. The first thing that I just want to mention is there are a lot of people who ask the question, people of a certain age might be more vulnerable to COVID, or people with certain medical conditions might be more vulnerable to COVID. Is it okay for employers to ask about that, or to decide we're not going to cast anybody over age whatever because we are worried that they might be susceptible to COVID? And the EEOC has made it clear that's not okay. That is illegal discrimination. It's certainly not okay under our collective bargaining agreements. And we are being very proactive with employers to say, look, that's a decision that person needs to make. If they need an accommodation under the ADA, then it's your obligation as an employer to work with them to do that. So you inform the person and let the person decide what works for them, rather than making broad-based assumptions just based on a factor like age or medical condition, et cetera. In terms of our other diversity advocacy, because we're always trying to push in that direction, I think, aside from the pandemic, there's obviously a broader social movement going on right now with Black Lives Matter, and obviously that's focused on the government and policing and those kinds of areas. But I think it's led to a broader conversation that's happening about inclusion, and we're certainly interested in that. We have a structure within our organization, both from our members and our staff, where we're constantly pushing for greater inclusion in the industry. And perhaps this change in the way that production is made will provide us some opportunities to push forward in that as well.
Yeah, lots of changes with the Academy Awards, et cetera. I imagine that there's also some things happening with you. Okay, so you are general counsel.
Yes.
You are protecting a lot of legal rights, et cetera. And there's a huge issue with artificial intelligence and image manipulation and performers of all types, their images being used without their knowledge, used illegally, or even just being used because it's efficient in regards to not having to have the performer there. That's an incredibly complicated, difficult, and fast-moving realm. How are you managing that?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is really the cutting edge of the future. We're fortunate that we have people on our legal team. In fact, one of my associate general counsels actually just got an advanced law degree specifically focused on deepfake technology, which is one aspect of the technology you're talking about, which is where people use AI to help create a false representation of a person, either their voice or even their image. There's a very famous deepfake that Jordan Peele made of Barack Obama that's out on the web. If anyone hasn't seen it, they might take a look at that, because it's a great example of what can be done with this type of technology. The good news is that the major employers in our industry who have had access to this type of technology, frankly, for quite a while prior to the public getting access to it, they've been pretty responsible in its use, and we have agreements with them about how things like digital scanning of individuals can be used, and consent and compensation for people who are being scanned and have their scans being used. This is again from employers who have contracts with us, for example. The real area of concern, the biggest area of concern for us right now, is deepfakes and unauthorized use of this technology. And particularly, there's a very large quantity of illegal pornographic material created using this technology, with our members' faces, for example, being digitally moved onto the bodies of other people doing things. And it's very distressing, especially to people who might, for example, have been victims of abuse earlier in their life, or whatever, to find out they've now been involuntarily cast in a pornographic movie or something like that. So we're really focused on trying to constrain that as much as we can. It is hard to, it's hard to achieve 100% success there, but there has been legislation that we've sponsored here in California and also in New York to provide additional rights to performers and others and other individuals to take on people who are misusing their image and likeness in that way.
You need a whole division just to seek out. I mean, because I can see, from a corporate, you can find things, but how do you find that individual in another country, or, that definitely doesn't want to be found in the deep, in the dark web? How do you even begin to find those people and prosecute them or turn them over to law enforcement? How is that even possible?
It's very difficult. I mean, it really is almost impossible. I think one of the strategies is to try and just get the content taken down as much as possible by the major sources. I mean, you're probably never going to scour the dark web of that kind of thing, but for a lot of people, not having something like that pop up when their name is searched in Google would be a great first step. And so that's one of the things that we're looking for, is the ability for performers and others, it's not only performers, but performers and others, to be able to take some kind of action themselves that can help remedy the situation. By the way, this has implications beyond the entertainment industry. We also represent broadcast journalists, as you probably know, and we have we've seen examples of people misusing this technology to create false impressions that either journalists or subjects of journalistic interviews and things like that have said things that they haven't. So, I mean, we've seen it just in the public, in the general political sphere. We've seen people manipulate content in that way. And so it's going to be really important for our democracy, in my view, for us to get a handle on how to authenticate what's real and not allow this kind of technology to confuse us about what's actually happening.
So you brought up broadcast journalists, and that's obviously part of the merger that took place in 2012 between the Screen Actors Guild and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. How has that affected the union at large? How is it doing? There was a lot of controversy about it before, and then ultimately, when the merger came, it wasn't that difficult. So now you have a bit of a bird's eye perspective on how it's all worked. Has it melded well, and do you think that's been a boon for the organization or the union at large?
Sure. I mean, I know that there's some of our members who have different viewpoints on this, but I think the broadly held viewpoint is that the merger has turned out better than anyone anticipated that it would. Certainly, that's my view from my perspective. I've worked at SAG and now SAG-AFTRA for it'll be 20 years this November, and so I have quite a perspective on that. And I think that our merged union is far stronger than either of the predecessor unions were individually. It's eliminated any source of competition or division between those two entities that no longer exist. We're now one, and we've been one for 8 years now. And I think we can see the results in a number of areas. Things like we now have contracts covering music videos where neither union did before. We now have certain kind of results that we bargained for that we never had previously. I think our bargaining leverage has increased, and certainly our ability to influence public policy in areas that we're focused on has also increased. So I really feel that the merger has been very successful. I think our members generally feel that way, and we're excited to continue, building a stronger union, because in the end, the union is all about the members. Without the members, there's no point in having the union. Without the members, the union has no strength. So we're very focused on the fact that what we can do to help make sure our members are well taken care of and that their needs are met, that's really what we're here for.
But the word media has been redefined multiple times over in a very short period of time. Now we all have platforms and streaming services and gaming and everything like that that's now under the realm of these contracts. How complicated has just even the conceit of the unions become in a very short period of time?
Well, it's grown a lot, and it is very complicated. I mean, it's more complex than I think it ever was. We, as a union, are representing employees in really 4 different industries, because we obviously have the motion picture, television, new media industry, we have broadcast journalism, we have the music industry, and the advertising industry. So between those four industries, a lot of what they do is similar, but a lot of what they do is very different. And of course, our broadcast journalists and our recording artists, they have some things in common, and in some ways their work is very different. But one of the things that I think is most inspiring about working for SAG-AFTRA is watching our members stand up for each other and really seeing that solidarity. So when there's a tough contract negotiation with a broadcast station, let's say, we've got our recording artist members will come out and they will be at a rally and stand up for the rights of our other members. They really do have a sense of unity even when they work in different areas and different industries. And so I think that's something that's really powerful and something that personally I'm very proud of.
Well, multiple platforms.
Yeah.
I mean, and also those platforms are now producing. So, Amazon in Albuquerque, New Mexico, how is that? How are you adapting to all of these changes? You just keep more and more departments cropping up as more and more platforms are created and that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, a lot of the platforms, for example, the streaming platforms, we really view a lot of the contract issues for streaming as very similar to television, and that's sort of the framework that's been in. So the volume is definitely increased very substantially, but the issues, many of the issues are the same from a point of view of production. In terms of where production goes, we're very used to production moving around the country and actually around the world, because obviously a lot of productions shoot on location. It's not a new idea that sometimes productions move to different locations due to tax incentives or other reasons. And so we have locals that cover all of the United States, and we have relationships with our sister unions around the world so that we can stay engaged with wherever our productions are going and however that work is happening. So it's a lot of work. It is really complicated, to totally agree with you, but I think we're actually able to manage that, hopefully without the creation of a whole lot of departments, but sometimes with reallocating resources. It also does sometimes mean when things shift, you have to shift things along with it, and being flexible and a little bit nimble is definitely part of the gig.
This is probably far too inside for the general, but I was just thinking the residual situation with rights windows and such with streaming services has got to have changed things quite dramatically.
Yeah, we definitely, we've been negotiating for residuals for new media productions for a number of years. We're always looking to improve upon those residual formulas, and that's true of our sister unions too. I think one of the things that's really interesting about residuals, though, is residuals has been a lifeblood of our members during this pandemic. And in fact, we've had about 60 to 70 staff members working in the office throughout the course of the pandemic as designated essential workers with social distancing, physical distancing, and masks and PPE and everything. But we've been processing hundreds of thousands of residuals checks, about 100,000 residuals checks a week since the start of the pandemic. And I've gotten so much feedback from members who really appreciate that the staff was ready, willing, and able to come in and do that so that they could continue to receive the residuals that a lot of performers really rely on to just make ends meet, and especially in these times.
Which makes me think, and forgive this question, but but I know that a lot of people think about this.
Sure.
SAG membership has always been a catch-22. In order to become a member of SAG, you had to have a job. In order to get a job, you had to be a member of SAG. AFTRA was a pay to entry. That's gone away with the merger. Are there any thoughts, conversations, or anything moving forward to make it more accessible and available to young talent or to talent that wants to become involved in the entertainment industry and be part of SAG-AFTRA? Is there anything on the horizon? Are there any whispers in the wind? Is anything going to change, or is it just going to be you have to be SAG in order to get to work on a SAG and vice versa?
Sure. The only constant in SAG-AFTRA is change. So definitely that is a topic of conversation. There is a real interest in putting programs in place to help encourage people who are coming out of, let's say film school, for example, or whatever, to have that opportunity. And in fact, we do occasionally have situations where, as part of organizing a new work area or a new type of producer or whatever, where we may have special eligibility requirements in place. So I do think that there is a good probability that we will have movement along those lines. What I don't think will happen, at least not, I don't foresee in the immediate future, any sort of broad reopening of eligibility, because I think there is a sense that you should have a certain minimum level of professional standing to really to be in the union, and that it's not a bad thing for people to have some freedom to learn a little bit before that's their first step. So it depends on the person's particular career path, and as you probably know, we have a lot of young performer members. We have members who have joined as very young children and have had a very successful professional career before they ever turn 18.
Right.
So I think it will always be flexible, but there will always be some element of having secured professional employment in the industry that's part of that consideration as well.
But you did mention, there are accommodations. There are opportunities for, as you said, young producers to become their own conduit for their own ability to be a member of the union.
Right. There's a lot of low budget and student productions out there. Some of the low budget productions provide the opportunity for people to join based on that. Generally, student productions don't qualify for that, but low budget productions generally do. And so, and there are thousands of them every year. So I think one of the things that you see a lot of is actually people building that experience by working in the low budget space, and then finding that at the right time for them, the opportunity to join presents itself. But we have hundreds of people join every month. So we don't have a shortage of new members joining. And I think that reflects the passion that people have for working in this industry, in these industries. And it also reflects the fact that when you work as a freelance artist in industries like ours, you really need someone looking out for you. You need someone watching your back, because it's not the same thing as working in an office. It's not the same thing as having a regular job. It's very different. And being part of that community and having that support is really, really important.
So I imagine performers really want to know as much information as possible during these times. So is there a place that they can go to? Is there a website that they can reference updated information?
Absolutely. For the back to work process, it's right there on our website at www.sagaftra.org/back-to-work. And if people need more information about COVID-specific resources, for example, unemployment, offices, contacts for all of the 50 states, and various other resources that are specific pandemic information, that's on our website as well at www.sagaftra.org/COVID-19.
You're not an actor, you're not a performing artist, but you have a personal relationship with someone who is. So has that colored how you look at what SAG-AFTRA does from a COO perspective and general counsel?
Oh, sure. Yeah, my husband is an actor and has been a member of SAG and SAG-AFTRA since actually before I started working there. And so I've witnessed, firsthand what it's like to live the life of being an actor and how difficult it is, and it is a very difficult career to pursue because there's so much rejection, and it's so, getting a job, the biggest part of your job is getting a job, and that's always a challenge. So it does inform my work, but I'm pretty much around performers and journalists 24/7, 365 between home and work. And so I have a passion for that. Even though my last performance was in 8th grade, I am very happy and proud to support and defend and represent the people who tell those stories. And when you get to watch a powerful performance, it takes your breath away. And it's just something that I feel very proud about. And our children, I've definitely got a couple of performers in training, so to speak.
Lawyers, a couple.
I don't know about any lawyers. I think so, based on their ability to negotiate for bedtimes and things like that. But so probably some lawyers too. But definitely some very talented dancers and musicians in my immediate family. So and I'll be proud to represent them too if that's the path they choose.
Well, the most important person to a performer is an audience member. So thank you so much for all of this really interesting information, and I certainly hope that things continue to be safe and progress moving forward.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
All right, take care. And that's a wrap on this edition of LA Currents.